Greetings, everyone. Crimea Island, once proudly declared by the Kremlin as an unsinkable warship and an impregnable fortress in the Black Sea, is now facing critical cracks. A tragic and stunning scenario is slowly unfolding behind the velvet curtain of geopolitics for the first time since the war began. It is now closer than ever to Phase 2, with the Crimea Sea becoming a completely isolated oasis, paving the way for a historic large-scale ground offensive. And here are the main contents in today's video. The Kremlin's S-400 Panzer air defense system has collapsed. For the first time in the history of the war, Putin's so-called impregnable fortress is facing the risk of being turned into a completely isolated and wild island. With a new 360-degree attack, the Black Sea Fleet had to retreat. An unprecedented asymmetric attack combining Ukraine's land, Navy, and air forces is completely crushing the Kremlin's cumbersome defense doctrine. How did Ukraine manage to blind the most solid air defense network, break every coastal brigade, and force Russia's 60,000-strong army group into a state of extreme psychological panic? Ammunition depots and fuel stores are burning, paralyzing Russia's supply chain. The Kyiv General Staff quietly discovered a deadly strategic point right in the Sibis marshlands, which had been neglected by Russian generals. Can Ukraine's armored brigades break through the infamous Surovikin defensive line in time to permanently cut off the military corridor, turning Crimea into a giant crushing funnel and shattering the Kremlin's ambitions? Russian troops overlooked this area. The Kyiv General Staff quietly recognized a key strategic point in the Sibis marshlands that had been missed before. Before the psychological surrender. Ladies and gentlemen, for the first time since the war began, the troops have been neglected. In Dzhankoi, Russian troops are facing the risk of psychological surrender. Ladies and gentlemen, for the first time since the opening shots of the war, Kyiv is closer than ever to realizing his ambitions. Kyiv is closer than ever to realizing the ambition of turning Crimea into a completely isolated island. The strategic intention behind the curtain is nothing other than a massive direct ground assault on the peninsula. What once seemed nearly impossible is now central to every calculation by the Ukrainian military leadership. To pave the way for a ground offensive that once seemed impossible, it has now become the focal point in every calculation of the Ukrainian military leadership. In this historic campaign, the supply lines connecting the southern front with Crimea have been placed under the control and overwhelming force of the Ukrainian military. Strategic and vital bridges like Chorna and Amiens have continuously suffered from repeated attacks. The army, they are determined to turn it into a killing zone. Even though the Russian command tries to maintain the supply line by building temporary pontoon bridges, the intelligence network and relentless offensive power continue to press on. Despite efforts to maintain the supply line by building makeshift pontoon bridges, Kyiv's intelligence network and relentless offensive power have not allowed any temporary structures to survive. Even the main highway, the lifeline stretching from Rostov-on-Don through Mariupol, is struggling under suffocating pressure. In the south, the threat is becoming increasingly apparent. The main highway, the vital artery stretching from Rostov-on-Don through Mariupol, is also under severe strain. Russia has even had to withdraw some units from the Kinburn Peninsula. Kyiv's general staff is covertly turning the strategic corridor to Crimea into a deadly trap for Putin's forces. On this fierce front, Russian supply convoys are rendered combat ineffective before they even reach the muddy ground. The southern front lines. Notably, these strangulation operations are being carried out using an extremely effective asymmetric warfare method. The FFP suicide drone systems have become feared, but possess absolute accuracy. The Russian army's logistics network in the occupied territories has been left completely vulnerable in the face of this cutting-edge technology. Kyiv's general staff has left only the Kerch Bridge isolated. However, quietly using the land route in the south is the last option that Russian generals want to rely on for logistics connections. Because Kerch itself is already on the death list as one of the next targets of Ukraine, which is why the Russian army wants to cling to it for logistics connections. In this isolation strategy, these statements are supported by key Ukrainian military leaders. Minister Somykalo Fedorov and Drone Force Commander Maria Roddy are sending strong signals. Mr. Fedorov affirmed in the clearest possible language that the entire region is being tightened step by step by Kyiv's manned vehicles. And Kyiv has quietly sought ways to completely cut off this peninsula from the outside world, leading to devastating and unpredictable consequences for Russian troops on the battlefield. The pressing question now is how Ukraine will carry out this major offensive operation. Though no longer impossible, this remains a tough path for Kyiv, as they must quietly navigate difficult areas. The main offensive will break through the Zaporizhia front, sweep the Tokmak defensive line, and push Russian troops toward the Sea of Azov. This is exactly the area where Kyiv's forces quietly identified a deadly weak point in the Sivas marshes, which Russian troops under Surovikin had largely overlooked. If this defensive line is broken by armored brigades, Ukraine will permanently cut off the enemy. The battlefield corridor links Russia to Crimea, fully isolating Moscow's southern forces. Next, military pressure will target the Barakov Isthmus and the Amiens defensive line. This narrow strip of land is the most strategically important, highly defensible, yet frightening for Kyiv if military pressure targets the Barakov Isthmus and Amiens defensive line. The rugged terrain of the Barakov Isthmus provides a natural defensive advantage for Russian forces, but a defensive force that has been exhausted from the air and continuously subjected to artillery barrages will become completely powerless in this narrow killing ground. The Kyiv General Staff avoided risky bets, instead discreetly seeking a weak spot in the Sivas marshes, a natural barrier overlooked by Russian generals. This area became the Achilles heel, allowing Ukrainian forces to launch a surprise raid that badly weakened enemy defenses. Finally, there is the problem at sea. If Kyiv wants a successful ground campaign into Crimea, they must neutralize the power of the Russian Navy in the Black Sea. Although the Kremlin can still strike from the sea, the balance of power in the Black Sea has shifted, forcing Russian commanders to watch their backs and abandon their positions, fleeing the Black Sea. On the sea, advanced unmanned suicide boats have been deployed. Kyiv has been relentless and tireless. They have blocked most of the free movement areas of the war in the Usababi and Maguza regions, turning into cold-blooded and tireless monsters of the ocean. They have blocked most of it. Russian officers and soldiers surround the peninsula. The waters that used to be the home turf of Moscow have become a deadly trap, directly threatening the entire infrastructure system, making it even more isolated. Deep strike groups using missile fire from the General Staff have set a deadly trap, directly threatening the entire infrastructure and making the Sea Corps even more dangerous. Long-range missiles supplied by the West have paralyzed command centers and posts. Kyiv quietly strikes deep with long-range cruise missiles provided by Western allies, turning the peninsula into a deadly zone. This suffocating pressure helps Kyiv gradually expose the weaknesses in Russia's maritime defenses. Neutralizing the air defense network has been pivotal in weakening Russia's maritime defenses. Here, it's no longer an overwhelming challenge. The Ukrainian army has repeatedly proven they can easily penetrate the area, trapping Russian commanders and forcing their troops to abandon their positions. The combination is remarkable. The combination of airstrikes, ground operations, and naval warfare is forming a strategic pincer, completely overturning the defensive calculations of the Russian forces. Kyiv's general staff has quietly identified the key areas, and now Russian commanders are struggling with the constant threat of a 360-degree attack, an invisible danger that could strike from any direction at any moment. The isolation is pushing the occupying troops into a suffocating psychological trap, right on the land they hold, eroding and destroying the Kremlin's ability to control Crimea day by day. This is the ideal strategic space for Ukraine to launch a major offensive. This strangulation strategy goes beyond cutting off reinforcements and supplies. It aims to break the enemy's will. The goal is to force a large army group to surrender under the psychological pressure of encirclement. The crucial first step is to permanently sever the Chonhar transportation bottleneck and completely erase the Kerch Bridge from the map. Chonhar is the main transit hub, the vital artery right at the front line. The peninsula's railway network. Striking this key location under a barrage of fire will trigger a domino effect, causing both the eastern and western fronts of Crimea to collapse simultaneously. Next, the second phase is to make Crimea a funnel and use precision weapons to destroy targets inside. Powerful weapons like ATS-EMS missiles or Storm Shadow will now target fuel depots and ammunition bunkers, hitting Russian troops with millimeter precision. Reserving these high-value weapons for the later stage is a matter of strict economic calculation. At first, the general staff in Kyiv prioritized using cheaper attacks to exhaust Russia's air defense missile stockpiles. This plan is crucial, as experienced commanders agree that directly assaulting a well-supplied fortress would be a deadly mistake for Ukraine and result in a brutal war of attrition. Understanding this, the Ukrainian army is carrying out the destruction of air bases, logistics facilities, and the remaining fragments of the general staff. The fact that Russian naval forces had to flee their bases in the Black Sea is clear evidence that all support from the western sea direction of Crimea has been cut off. The general staff in Kyiv is doing everything to block every route that Moscow could use for reinforcements. Russia remains silent despite deadly threats in the Sivas region. General Vrop's recent comment about not understanding how Ukraine could turn Crimea into an island highlights this strategic disconnect. Difficulties, burning oil tanks, and Russia's logistics chain is completely paralyzed. When a diplomat has quietly found the deadly zone in the area, generals and soldiers forgot. The Kyiv government quietly found the deadly zone right in front of their eyes. It exposes the serious breakdown in communication in the area. On the ground, bridges are burning and shells are falling everywhere. Soldiers are bleeding on the front lines while political officials are at Moscow. On the ground, bridges are burning, shells are exploding, fuel tanks are running dry, and the Kremlin is completely powerless to find a tactical solution. To stop the Russian storm, they need a tactical solution to prevent the approaching land tempest. This is a systemic error. The storm is approaching. This systemic error originated from Kyiv's early geopolitical miscalculations. When Russia built its defense plan for Crimea, it was based on the mistaken assumption that the front line would never retreat close to the edge of the peninsula. Unable to protect the skies or supply lines, Moscow now relies on abstract propaganda. However, the songs of invincibility on Russian military television can no longer hide the long lines of people waiting to buy goods or the scarcity of essential items on supermarket shelves in Crimea. Instead of trying to hide it, the long lines of people waiting to buy goods or the scarcity of essential items on supermarket shelves in Crimea are now plain to see. Instead of facing the truth to come up with practical measures or build a new supply doctrine, the Russian military command is trying to buy time with a policy of blind denial. The fact that Moscow has left the strategic Crimea corridor in a defenseless state, while the Russian military command is still trying to buy time with a policy of blind denial, blindly fell into a deadly trap. Right now, this is giving Kyiv unprecedented operational opportunities. In such a situation, what is the Kremlin really hoping for? And can they continue to maintain control of the peninsula as they claimed? To answer that, first we need to look at the quagmire of Russian defensive lines at this fortress. The air defense system, once the pride of the Russian military, has been severely eroded and depleted after relentless missile and long-range drone attacks by Ukraine. Famous names like the S-400, S-300, long-range missile defense systems, and artillery complexes have faced relentless attacks by Ukraine's medium and long-range missiles and drones. Pantsir S-1, Pantsir S-2, short-range air defense missiles and advanced radar stations have been repeatedly targeted. Sources in Kyiv report that dozens of air defense weapons and radar stations in Crimea have been destroyed or abandoned by Russia. This irreparable loss to the general staff has silently broken the deadly network right in the swampy area. Russian generals and soldiers across the entire peninsula have created deadly gaps for Ukrainian drone swarms to penetrate deep into the interior. The Russians are struggling as they try to patch these gaps by moving in replacement parts or redeploying units from other strategic areas. The Russian command is falling into a dilemma as they attempt to fill these gaps by moving in replacement parts or shifting units from other strategic regions. The sharp intelligence tempo and relentless attacks by Ukraine have not given them a chance to recover. Phase 2 of the general offensive. Kyiv secretly. Please subscribe for the latest updates. Find the area where Russian troops are bogged down and facing the risk of a collapse in morale. Through asymmetric warfare tactics, Ukraine's cheap medium-range drone strikes are easily neutralizing those forgotten systems. The general staff uses asymmetric warfare tactics with waves of medium-range drone strikes. Kyiv has quietly identified the vulnerable area around Sivas. Now they no longer have enough strength to protect strategic military airfields like Saki and Dzhankoi, as well as key ports and critical logistical hubs deep inside Crimea, which have been neglected for a long time. The station units at the general headquarters are clearly becoming too thin in the face of a potential large-scale ground offensive from Kyiv. Quietly searching for positions, Russia's resources are clearly becoming too thin in the face of a potential large-scale ground offensive from Kyiv. Russian forces are deployed at this fortress. The network right at this fortress is mainly defensive and logistical in nature, with an estimated scale ranging from about 40,000 to 60,000 troops, including both permanent garrison forces and rotating units. This number is a mixed collection from the remnants of the Black Sea Fleet, air defense units, and Russian ground troops, Navy, National Guard forces, and various army components. Within that defensive structure, the 32nd Corps and the 126th Coastal Defense Brigade serve as the main backbone to maintain the presence of Moscow. However, this military structure is quietly deteriorating in the swampy region as every Russian officer and soldier in Crimea has to live in constant fear of sudden missile strikes at any moment. On the ground, fortifications are being hastily dug and reinforced. The Kyiv command is quietly searching for weak points on the ground, while fortifications are being hurriedly excavated and strengthened. The Sivas marshes and the entire coastal strip are covered with a system of trenches, minefields, anti-tank obstacles, and coastal artillery positions. Desperation is clear in the coastal defenses at Sevastopol, with trenches, minefields, obstacles, and Russian officers still visible. Command continues major fortification in high-risk areas against possible amphibious assaults. As Ukrainian Navy spokesman Dmytro Petenchuk once analyzed, the Russian command truly considers a potential Ukrainian amphibious operation to be a real and present threat. They deployed mobile coastal missile systems like Bastion, Bal, and Zubits at key sites. Kyiv also suffered losses at Novorossiysk base. Wave and floating barriers and more air defense units were added. The entire area is heavily fortified and filled with obstacles, but Ukrainian assault boats have repeatedly demonstrated their ability to skillfully maneuver through these physical barriers to penetrate deep into enemy strongholds. Kyiv's naval defense efforts now focus on fortification and rapid response, aiming to penetrate deep into the enemy's port strongholds. And the fleet may help them survive in the short term, but it also pushes them to forget. Logistics are at an unimaginable level and seriously erode combat effectiveness. Even alternative ports like Novorossiysk are no longer safe havens as they are within Ukraine's firing range and are constantly subjected to strikes. Even the densest coastal defenses can only partly protect against amphibious threats and are powerless against the combined land, Navy, and air pressure Kyiv is deploying. These actual data are evidence that the overall strategy of isolating Crimea, turning the peninsula from a strategic asset into a military burden for Ukraine, has reached a specific turning point. Kyiv has
đã chạm đến một ngưỡng bước ngoặt cụ thể.
Completed the groundwork for a major offensive to retake the peninsula by crippling supply lines, gradually stripping away air superiority, controlling the sea, and forcing the Russian garrison into a dead end of total annihilation. For the first time since the peninsula was occupied, the situation here is no longer a classic trench war, but has evolved into a multi-layered, sophisticated, and complex island campaign. A major thrust pierced through the Zaporizhia axis toward Melitopol and Tokmak, combining with other efforts to form a multi-layered, sophisticated, and complex encirclement campaign. Raids through narrow strips of land like Barakov or the Sivas marshes possess explosive power that can split all Russian forces in Sivas in two.
Sở hữu một sức mạnh bùng nổ có thể
Russian generals and soldiers left their posts.